It took a 10-year campaign to deliver the overwhelming yes vote in the 1967 referendum, which finally gave Indigenous Australians full citizenship rights in their own country. Almost half a century on, an expert panel has called for more changes to the Constitution to promote the advancement of Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders and rid it of any remaining racist sections. Despite bipartisan support for the idea that the nation's guiding document should acknowledge Indigenous Australians, critics warn the current proposal is so dangerously complex the referendum will be doomed to failure. And with it, much of the impetus for change which began with an extraordinary campaign by Indigenous activists in the 60s. Deborah Cornwall reports.
You can't trust a bloody blackfellow, no matter where he is. And he gets on the plonk and he won't work.
A few of them are nice and they're clean and they wear nice clothes and everything, but most of them are all dirty and everything.
Aboriginal Australians were all but invisible in the 60s, most of them fringe dwellers, forbidden to travel, paid in meat instead of dollars.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mrs. Faith Bandler.
It was in this climate Faith Bandler, a daughter of a South Sea Islander slave, began pressing a simple proposition for equal citizenship rights. A decade-long campaign that captured the mood for change and an overwhelming yes vote at the 1967 referendum.
The eyes of the world are on Australia.
I couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. I didn't think that people cared that much about it.
45 years on, Indigenous Australians no longer need licences or dog tags to work and travel. But the poor health and poverty rates of Aboriginal communities remains an international blight. And while land rights have since been established in the High Court, there remains some unfinished business with the Constitution, which even now fails to acknowledge Aboriginals as the nation's first people.
That's something that needs to be fixed. There was no actual recognition of our history, the history of Australia, and the contribution over a period of 50,000 years of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders.
As a nation, we are big enough, and it is the right time to say yes to an understanding of our past, to say yes to constitutional change, and to say yes to a future more united and more reconciled than we have ever been before.
Prime Minister, our report.
This week, the Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, backed a report by an expert panel of lawyers and Indigenous leaders who've called for further constitutional reform and are pushing for a second referendum on Aboriginal rights as early as next year.
Well, the 67 referendum was a magnificent achievement. It was the most successful referendum ever. Over 90% voted in favour, and frankly, we hope to replicate that this time round.
The panel say this time round the prohibition of race discrimination should be included in the Constitution, along with the advancement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and a recognition of their relationship with the land, their cultures, heritage and languages. But while the referendum has bipartisan support, critics fear the panel has overreached itself with proposed changes that will be far too complex to sell to the public.
If you take something that is complicated, difficult to explain, and in some senses is seen as unpredictable, then in racing terms, that's a dog. This is a good cause. There should be recognition of Indigenous people in the Constitution, but if you put the wrong proposal up, it will fail.
First of all, we've got to say that Australian people aren't silly. They aren't a bunch of rednecks. The polling tells us that they're all supportive of including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and recognising them in the Constitution. It's about how we keep it simple.
The most contentious proposal is to include a provision in the Constitution that prohibits race discrimination, a move constitutional lawyers say is unnecessary given Commonwealth and state anti-discrimination laws. and creates unpredictable and potentially dangerous results.
This committee has effectively gone beyond its brief and said, well, what we'd like is a whole provision guaranteeing against discrimination on the grounds of race, ethnicity and colour. Now, many things could be characterised as being to do with race or colour or ethnicity, and if that's right, what you do end up with is a guarantee that you just don't know where it will go. Once it's in the Constitution, it effectively cannot be changed.
It's a long way from the heady days when Faith Bandler, the Freedom Riders and the Wave Hill mob led the push for a new order for Indigenous Australians, with the direct appeal to the hearts and minds of the nation.
Vote yes and give them rights and freedoms just like me and you. Vote yes for Aborigines.
This time round, it'll be up to the government to roll out an education program explaining the referendum, with the panel's recommendations as the starting point.
Obviously, you know, it would be diabolical to put up something that everybody knows the Australian public just aren't going to go for, because can you imagine the damage that's going to do to young Aboriginal people? In which case I think that you would pull it back and you would go for something a lot simpler, because the idea is that you reflect the mood of the country and where the country's at.
The reality is public education programs do not win referenda. We learned that at the Republican exercise. What wins referenda are simple, clear, uncontroversial proposals that people agree with. And that's what we have to have on Indigenous recognition.
Deborah Cornwall reporting there.